Welcome again to our series on probing the Genesis creation account. This is episode part 5. We'll be considering the role of hermeneutics in the creation debate. Now there's a handout that corresponds to this, handout number 14 on the website, a defense of a literal hermeneutic for interpreting Genesis 1. I begin by making the statement, a proper application of hermeneutics will result in a literal six-day creation view, I believe. Let me give you several reasons. Reason one is this. The literary genre of Genesis chapters 1 through 2, and for that matter all of Genesis 1 through 11, is that of historical narrative, not that of poetry or myth. So if the literary genre was one of poetry or myth, we might not expect that everything should be understood quite so literally in Genesis chapter 1. But that's not the case. There are some very good reasons for understanding this as historical narrative, and therefore we should understand Genesis 1 just as literally as we would understand other historical narratives that make up the book of Genesis. So the importance of this issue, we must decide what kind of hermeneutic we're going to utilize for the interpretation of Genesis 1 to 2. Now some support for this being a historical narrative. The first reason is that the primary feature of historical narrative is the preponderance in the Hebrew text of what is called the Vav consecutive sequence, which is exactly what we have in Genesis 1 and 2. Now this is a particular type of Hebrew structure, a conjunction Vav on a particular form of a Hebrew verb. We have an example of this in Genesis 1, verse 3. It begins with the Vav consecutive on the verb. And the verse reads in Hebrew, Vayomer Elohim Yehi Or Vayehi Or. So the first word in that sentence was Vayomer, the conjunction Vav, on the imperfect form of the verb amar, altogether pronounced vayomer. And this is very characteristic of historical narrative. But more noticeably, in Genesis 1, we have 50 Vav consecutive imperfect forms. That's an average of 1.6 per verse. That's more than all but 3 of the first 20 chapters of Genesis. Keep in mind that the narrative beginning with Abraham is in chapter 12, so, most people would consider that to be historical narrative. Well, Genesis 1 is every bit as much historical narrative as chapter 12 would be. Secondly, the primary feature of Hebrew poetry, which is parallelism, is noticeably absence. So an example of Hebrew parallelism is what we would find in a passage like Psalm 19, verse 1. The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. So in these two lines, we see the heavens are paralleled in the first line by the words their expanse in the second line. Also, in the first line, they're telling of the glory of God, parallels, they're declaring the work of his hands. Now that's very typical of Hebrew poetry, like we find in many places in the Psalms. But we don't have that in Genesis 1. This is not Hebrew poetry. It is historical narrative. Thirdly, we have a word called toledot. And the first occurrence of this is in chapter 2, verse 4. So the toledot statement in Genesis 2, verse 4, reflects that this unit is an integral part of the historical narratives that comprise the whole of Genesis. Now usually this word toledot is translated by something like, these are the generations of, or maybe this is the account of. So we'll look at this a little bit more in detail, and by the way, there is a handout for this, handout number 15, which lays out the toledot structure of Genesis. So the word toledot comes from a Hebrew verb yalad, which means to bear or give, to bring forth, to give birth to. So something brings about something else, we might say. And that's how the book of Genesis is all structured. We have this word toledot repeated all the way through the book. And you can, in each one of those, every time we come to a toledot word, it's introducing a new section of the book. So the book begins with the creation account in 1:1 through 2:3, and then we have a toledot statement, the toledot of the heavens and the earth. In other words, this is what the creation gave rise to. It's what came forth from it. And we find out in chapters 2 through 4 that, sin entered to the picture. It disrupted God's perfect creation, and sin spread to all mankind. So this structure of the book, we could actually lay it out as a chart. So here's a chart that I've created for the book of Genesis, in which the book of Genesis is developed in two primary parts. The first part is what I call the introduction. After the perfect creation, the perfect beginning we see there in Genesis 1, we discover that sin enters the picture, and then there's a deterioration of the race that results in Israel's election. And so beginning in chapter 11:27, when we have the word toledot again, and going through the remainder of the book, it's all concerned about Abram and his descendants. We have the Abrahamic promise of blessing is given to him in chapter 12, 1 through 3, and then that's developed through the remaining of the book. But each section that you see on the chart, whether it's 1:1 through 2:3 or 2:4 through 4:26, and so forth, larger sections in the latter part of the book, in the Abrahamic Isaac narrative, the Jacob narrative, and the Joseph narrative, we have the toledot statement initiates each section that we come to. So it's the primary characteristic by which the structure of the book is discerned. Now, a reason, too, why I think a proper application of hermeneutics results in a literal six-day creation view is because a departure from a literal hermeneutic leaves one with no reliable guidance. Some subpoints here. Number one, what evidence is there that a different hermeneutic should be used in the interpretation of just Genesis 1 and 2? In other words, we should expect a little hermeneutic. Why would we think of this differently? Is there any evidence for doing so? Now, some people would say, well, this thing of a framework, a literary framework, is evidence that a different hermeneutic should be used, but I've already commented that on the previous episode and explained that does not lead to the conclusion that these are not literal 24-hour days or that they're not sequential. Secondly, once you conclude that Genesis should be interpreted in some kind of a figurative way, then how far do you go with this? Or where do you stop? So what's the control of that? Point A, was Eden a literal garden, or was it only there for storytelling purposes? B, was the serpent a real animal that literally talked? C, were Adam and Eve even real historical people? D, is evolution the true explanation for the origin of our universe? Is Genesis 1 to 2 only a story, then, for the purpose of explaining about evil? So once you go down a figurative road, what are the controls on how you're interpreting? Where do you stop with that type of a hermeneutic? Reason 3, there's nothing in the text of Genesis 1 or 2 that even remotely hints that evolution was involved. Some support. 1, life is not said to develop from a single cell organism. Secondly, man does not originate from lower forms of life, but is created noticeably distinct from the animal world. He's made in the image of God and is given the privilege of exercising dominion, that is, of ruling. Thirdly, the sequence of development of Genesis is in direct contradiction to the theory of evolution. Well, how so? Well, evolution teaches that the Big Bang came first, with stars, planets, sun. But Genesis 1, verses 11 through 13, reveals that vegetation on the earth came before the sun and the moon. So I find it very difficult to believe in evolution and believe the biblical account at the same time, because they contradict one another. Fourth, the biblical account reveals that all of creation came by God's spoken word, not by evolution and survival of the fittest. In Hebrews 11, verse 3, we read these words: "By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible." They're made by God's spoken word. He called it into existence by his word. Reason 4 for a literal six-day creation view and a literal hermeneutic is the testimony of the New Testament itself. The creation account in Genesis cannot involve millions of years, since man was present in the beginning. Support number 1 is Mark chapter 10, verse 6, which again, the context for that is Jesus' teaching on divorce, in which he said, "But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female." So you can have the beginning separated from there being human beings that were part of the beginning. It's not like there's millions of years went by until the evolution of man came about. No, the male and female were there from the beginning. We also observe Romans chapter 5, 12 through 21. Adam is the first man who brought death and condemnation for all mankind. Thus Adam was an historical figure, and there were no others before him. And finally, observe Romans chapter 1, verse 20. "Since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes have been clearly seen." A fifth reason: millions of years are not even needed to explain the geological rock layers. That is, once we accept the abundant evidence of a worldwide flood as described in Genesis 6 through 9. Now, some people say, well, the flood account there was only describing a local flood, not a worldwide flood. But yet it covered the peaks of the mountains. So how do you have a flood covering the peaks of the mountains that's restricted to only a local area? I guess it would look something like what you see on the screen here, which is obviously impossible. Water's going to spread out and fill any area that it can. Kind of a comical picture, though. I think shows how silly it would be to have a local flood theory. Now, some support for a worldwide flood. I think one of the greatest arguments for it is the sedimentary rock layers that are filled with land and marine life fossils in the Grand Canyon in Arizona of the United States. There you see a small picture of it here at the bottom of the screen. We'll enlarge that here. So the Grand Canyon attests to a worldwide flood. In the Grand Canyon, we find fossils of sea creatures in rock layers high above sea level, even in upper limestone levels of the rim of the canyon that are over 2,000 meters in elevation. How did they get there? Why are they there? Well, a worldwide flood would easily account for that being so. If we apply a little hermeneutic to Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and the flood narrative, what are we left with? Well, this results in 1, the universe and our earth were created by the spoken word of God through Jesus Christ in 6 literal 24-hour days. Second, the entire earth was covered by a catastrophic flood that left sedimentary rock layers with the appearance of great age, and probably led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. So we don't have to have millions of years for what we see today to have occurred. Third, we're basically left with a relatively young Earth. Now, some further decisions are going to need to be made related to the age of the Earth. 1, what do we do with the genealogies in Genesis 5 in Genesis 11? Are these what we call tight genealogies, that is, without gaps, or not? In other words, is the a person in this list, is every father and son listed, or is there a gap somewhere in it? Secondly, about the numerical data in Genesis 5 and 11. That is, where it gives how old a person was when he had a son, how much longer he lived, and what were the total number of years that he lived. We notice that this differs very significantly between the Hebrew Masoretic text and the Greek Septuagint. The Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew, but it came to be translated into Greek approximately 250 to 300 years before the time of Christ. And yet the numerical data in the Greek translation differs considerably from the Hebrew. Well, we'll get into that more in the next episode, episode 6, dating the creation and flood accounts in light of Genesis 5 and 11.